French President Emmanuel Macron has been slammed for saying a far-right or hard-left win in his snap election could spark a, quote, civil war. France is preparing to vote Sunday in the country's most polarizing ballot in decades. Macron called the parliamentary polls after the far-right national rally scored a runaway victory in European parliamentary elections earlier this month. His opponents are now urging him not to scare the public. The president's comments coming ahead of a key TV debate tonight that will pit Macron's centrist Prime Minister Gabriel Attal against far-right RN party leader Jordan Bardella and Manuel Bompard of the left-wing New Popular Front. We're going to talk about this more now with Clovis Casali, who joins me on set for more. Clovis, let's get back to those comments first that Macron made on this podcast Monday about France possibly heading toward a civil war. Those are very strong words. What more did he have to say?
Civil war, very unusual words in the mouth of the French president. So what is he saying exactly? Is he exaggerating? Emmanuel Macron is saying that the far-right bloc led by the National Rally, Le Pen, Bardella, as well as the left-wing bloc, which has a component, a radical left component, and some very minor far-left parties making up that alliance. Well, he says that they're both very dangerous for France, and if they get into government, if they get into power, then it could spark a civil war. Before we elaborate a bit more on this, let's take a listen to what Emmanuel Macron, the French president, actually said to this podcast. It was yesterday.
If we take your reasoning to its logical conclusion, either the country explodes or a civil war breaks out. And that's where I disagree with both extremes and those who follow them. And it's also what I'd like to alert people to. A lot of our compatriots go to the extremes because they often have anger or something that isn't being addressed. And there are a lot of people who vote for the extreme right because there's insecurity in their daily lives, because there's an immigration that they consider is not being dealt with. And they say to themselves, we haven't tried these parties out yet. And this party has been here for 7 years, so we're going to try something else. And my response to those people, I've taken in your message. I think we need to go much faster and much harder on security.
It's not the first time that Emmanuel Macron presents both the far-right and the left-wing bloc as dangerous and extremist. Ever since the campaign really began, Emmanuel Macron has been trying to say, listen, I have this centrist bloc with the ruling party and its allies, centrist parties, that are the only reasonable bloc parties fit to govern. And you have to pick our parties, otherwise you're going to have the far left or the far right in power. And it's interesting to see that he's been targeting a lot the left-wing bloc in recent days, because he sees that bloc rise in the polls and even in front of his own centrist bloc in the polls. And it seems that the far right is so far ahead from everyone else, that it's difficult for him to actually target this far-right bloc with Jordan Bardella. And why is he saying this? Because he's saying that these two blocs are fracturing society, stigmatizing communities, the far left accused of not doing enough against anti-Semitism, and on the other hand, the far right targeting Muslims and Islam way too much for the French president. Of course, our viewers can all have their own point of view on the situation, but clearly Emmanuel Macron trying to mobilize the French electorate and say, listen, you can't vote for any extreme party.
Now, of course, all of these issues are going to be debated tonight. The first debate in this election, we're going to see the far-right leader, Jordan Bardella, Gabriel Attal, the current centrist prime minister, but not a key leftist figure, Jean-Luc Mélenchon.
Jean-Luc Mélenchon, why isn't he here? It's a bit complicated, but let's say that Gabriel Attal is the clear favourite to be the prime minister if the centrist bloc of Emmanuel Macron wins. Jordan Bardella, very clear, if the right wing triumphs, he will be the prime minister. On the left, it's very complicated because you've got all these parties that come together. Communists, Greens, Socialists, radical left France Unbowed. And people in that bloc, especially the Socialists and the Greens, and even the Communists, hate Jean-Luc Mélenchon. A divisive figure. Even though he was the candidate for the left that got the most votes in the last presidential election, even though he and the France Unbowed movement party did rather well, better than the rest of the left in the past parliamentary elections. They just don't want him. He's too divisive, he's too outspoken, so they're trying to keep him aside, and they've already said, a lot of those left-wing leaders, he won't be our prime minister. That's why they're not putting him forward for this debate. Interesting, yesterday I was at the press conference of Jordan Bardella, and he was saying, give us Jean-Luc Mélenchon. We want to debate with him. He's the real leader. Don't bring anyone else. He is the person who is your prime minister. And he's doing that because he wants to stigmatize the left wing. Anyway, we're talking about the far right. Ahead in the polls, Marine Le Pen, who's the real boss of the party, was this morning on RTL, and she spoke about the elections and how she's convinced they will get an outright majority, an absolute majority in these parliamentary elections, and therefore be able to govern freely, pass laws in Parliament. Here's Marine Le Pen.
I think we're going to have an absolute majority and we will be able to govern. We will have a power-sharing setup with the president until 2027. That's not a problem. The Constitution is very clear. It's the Prime Minister who decides and implements the nation's politics.
Just to remind our viewers, until now you had what we call a Republican front. That is, every party getting together in the parliamentary elections in the second round to prevent the far right from winning. It's not really happening this time, and there's an open letter in Le Monde, the big French newspaper, with left-wing figures calling for this Republican front. They're mostly socialist, left-wing figures, but there are also a few of Emmanuel Macron's former ministers. They're all calling to prevent, by all means, the far right of getting into power. Let's just very briefly explain how it's going to work this election. First round, you can pick whatever candidate. Second round, if a candidate gets more than 12.5% of the votes, they can decide to stand in the second round. They can also decide to step down and basically call to vote for such or such candidates. So basically regroup electorate, regroup voting, and prevent the far right, for instance, from passing. This is what these people are calling for in an open letter. We'll have to wait and see if a lot of people really back this letter and not just left-wing figures. You need centrists and even the regular conservatives in order to do that and be able to really create that Republican front.
Thanks so much for that, Clovis. It's all about that first round vote with your heart, the second round vote with your head, as
Precisely.
they say here in France. Thank you so much for breaking it all down for us. It's always so